Hello and good morning. Hello everyone. How are you doing? I hope it is great. Wherever it is, whenever it is you are, welcome to Weekend Winters. I am Christy. These are the first words I am speaking today. If I end up having to clear my throat a lot and I sound like a groggy froggy, that is why. See right there. Anyway, I hope you are all doing well. I'm trying not to cough on the mic. I know I find that so annoying when I do it, so I can only imagine how bad it is for everyone who isn't made to have to put up with it. So yeah, hello to people in the chat. I see Sibwolf is here, Strap Mongoose, Transgamer Girl, hi. I hate doing this because I don't normally like to start off a show with an apology or any kind of talk with an apology. Most people don't care about your problems, but I'm kind of struggling a little bit. I had having kind of a rough day, so it might be a short show because I also have to do a patron friend sort of hangout later on today. But it looks like everything is fine. The sound is fine. I'm on screen. Let's go ahead and start the show. So yes, I hope everyone is doing well. Today I want to follow up a bit more on this whole discussion we're having as relates to the concepts of political left and right. What we've talked about so far. I've just washed my hair and it has a tendency to flip out, which is not too bad as long as it does it consistently, but I prefer it to sort of flip in, which is completely against its natural. So if you see me futzing with my hair a lot, that's because I'm trying to avoid, I guess you can't really see it relative to my background, but just a sort of really weird Pippi Longstocking sort of look. One of the things that I wanted to do is, so we've been talking about left-right. We've talked about how difficult it is. We've talked about the way that wording is a very, very much a challenge, that there are a lot of other influences, like how, and not only the wording of the question influences the responses, but how the responses are ordered. We've talked a little bit about even what questions you put in front of other questions have been shown to prime people to think about things or to lead them down a certain path. There's a very famous clip from either Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister where Sir Humphrey excuse me, Sir Humphrey talks about asking for public opinion on national service. And he's able to get the person responding to answer both ways depending on which questions he sets up with. Do you think unemployment is too high? Do you think the youth need structure and experience to help them build successful lives? Would you support a program of national service? And then another way where you don't do sort of like national service. Anyway, these things all aside, these things all understood, that left-right is squishy as a concept, that we would say it doesn't travel well, in that it doesn't apply consistently across borders. You can't just do an international survey of left-right and feel like you've come up with something meaningful about where the world is on a left-right global spectrum, because left and right in a place like America is going to be quite different from a place like Sweden, or even in China, or in other countries that are authoritarian. It might just be measurement problems in general that people are afraid to give honest answers to survey respondents because they're worried the government is going to find out what they think. All that being said, for all the problems of left-right, it's a concept that tends to stick around. It's a concept that we tend to use because it has some practical applications for orienting us to how we think about the world. And so in that case, if we're going to be using left-right anyway, or as someone says, it kind of measures it's measuring something, is what we can probably say is best about left-right. That if we conceptualize it correctly, if we word it in a way that we think is quite as unbiased as possible, we can pick up on consistent empirical differences that do have some stability, that do tend to persist over generations. That is to say, the effect of education is pretty consistent on the left-right spectrum, or on opinions on the left-right spectrum over time. The role of religiosity as a correlate tends to have, so we can say that there is something, but are we getting it perfectly? Probably not. What I wanted to do was, we looked at a really bad example a couple episodes ago of a battery of questions on, I'm going to transition Oh, look at us go. Over to this screen, we looked at the political compass test, and although they used the wording of some reputable surveys, there was a whole bunch of problems that we found in terms of the fuzziness of the concept being measured, the inability to do that kind of comparing between national perspectives. Hey, DN fan. And I wanted to look at a good, people who wanted to get a better left-right measurement. John Curtis is a political scientist. He works in Britain. And again, I'm working in British data mostly because that's kind of my framework for working with my own research. But you can think about how this would apply to your country as well. So this was suggested by John Curtis and Carolyn Bryson. I don't think I've met Carolyn Bryson. I've interacted with John Curtis several times. I wouldn't say I know him. He probably couldn't pick me out of a lineup, but we attended the same conference, and he has attended my talks and had some pretty good questions for my research. So he is talking about measurements of left-right orientation, libertarian and authoritarian orientations, and then some comments on those. I think we're going to skip environmentalism. Maybe not. We'll also look at environmentalism. Why not? It's Sunday. What else are you going to do? Now, I'm going to... I'm moving around. Okay, I'll skim. But they are writing proposed questions to the European working very well, or they're no longer relevant. And so we're going to stop asking those questions, and we're going to create some space on our questionnaire for new things that have emerged, new issues that are confronting us today. Or maybe they're just going to add more questions to the survey. They have a spot for 20 more questions. And instead of trying to fill those spots by themselves, the people running the survey, it's far more efficient to kind of put out a call to academics, like a bidding process for questions. And so academics will write up a little proposal like this, and they will say, here is the issue in terms of how we understand it, and this is the problems that we've had in the past. I'm just kind of making this up. I don't know what they're going to say in this document. I haven't read it. Here are a series of questions that have been tested, or we want to test, that we think will better measure this concept, or will measure it maybe for the first time, or it will measure it in a new way, whatever it is, whatever is the new intellectual contribution they want to make. And then the committee of people who decide what questions go on will look at the proposals. And the ones that they pick out, that researcher then is kind of got a little bit of a stake and also a responsibility to take that data and do something with it. It's like, okay, you've given us a suggestion for how we can improve our survey or how we can measure something in a new way. You've written this proposal saying this is the theoretical stuff you want to test. We're going to ask this question for you. Now it's up to you to do the work. We're not going to do this work, but we're going to give you the survey. So basically, it's kind of like doing a competitive bid, but with your mind. All right, so let's see what they have to say. People's underlying deep-root value orientations tend not only to predict and explain, we talked about prediction and explanation, remember? To predict and explain people's opinions, attitudes, and behavior patterns, but also to influence and be influenced by social, political, and economic changes within their respective societies. I really should have warmed up my voice before I started. The rigorous measurement of differences in value structures between countries and of changes in their character and distribution is one of the primary motivations of the European Social Survey. The problem, of course, is that the absence of a comprehensive, well-tested, and analytically powerful set of tools measuring underlying values across nations. Although the Eurobarometer and the European and World Values Surveys and the International Social Survey Program have all made major contributions upon which we certainly intend to draw, even their combined list of individual items and, more importantly, their combined array of validated scales are not comprehensive enough for the purposes of the ESS. I'm really sorry, guys. I should have coughed over my coffee this morning. Okay. The importance it is important for the ESS core module to identify and monitor the key socio-political cleavages that exist across cultures and nations within Europe and beyond. Robust measures of these dimensions tend to serve primarily as independent variables, helping to explain and predict other substantive variables such as party identification, voting behavior, and certain moral standpoints. But they too may serve on occasion as dependent variables in their own right, helping to describe and understand the nature of value changes in society and on occasions political changes as well. Whereas the terms of debate about particular issues tend to vary from country to country, underlying values, such as in relation to equality or liberty or people's religious identification, tend in contrast to transcend nations and are thus much more amenable to being tapped by multinational survey instruments such as the ESS. This is really well written, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed, it's just very parsimonious, it's very, very efficient. Every sentence makes a specific contribution. It's not repeating itself. Every sentence knows why it's in that paragraph. Every paragraph is organized to sort of systematically take the reader through all of the points in a way that you will understand on the first reading. So if you want to know what good writing looks like, these two have done a good job. As we are trying to measure abstract value orientations, it is cognitively too demanding to measure them directly with one or two questions, which good survey practice should always steer against. Rather, a set of questions should be administered, all of which are designed to tease out how far a respondent expresses support or opposition to different dimensions of the underlying value. Now, we talked about this in my previous talks as well, that you can't just ask people, are you racist? And then expect to get some sort of empirically accurate answer, because there are too many, people will lie, or people won't think they're racist when they are. And so what you need is a series of questions that ask about one concept at a time on a very clear, either dichotomous, yes, no kind of thing, do I fit, do I not, or some sort of identifiable spectrum. And this is what they're saying here, is you can't just do it with one or two questions, you need a set of questions. From these scales can be constructed, which summarizes, summarize respondents' answers to the set of questions. Of course, in developing scales, we need to apply stringent tests to ensure that they are indeed reliable measure of a single underlying value. I told you this before. If wishing to compare the relative explanatory power of different dimensions, each one should preferably be measured using similar metrics. We thus anticipate that each dimension will usually be measured by the construction of a Likert scale derived from a battery of agree-disagree items. In order to avoid the confounding influences of acquiescence effects, each of the set of items should contain some statements that are worded in one direction and some in the opposite direction. So I already talked to you about this too, that the wording of the question, if you agree, shouldn't allow you to always go agree, 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 agree. The question wording should be such that when you agree with a topic, sometimes you will pick the disagreement answer. And that means it's really doing two things. One, it's making sure that people are reading the questions. Because if they are just to go agree, 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 they're going to end up with a nonsensical a scale if you're analyzing it. And the other thing too is that if you always put things on agree, you tend to get that what they call acquiescence bias. So effects, sorry. People just go agree, agree. Of course, there is considerable debate about the key socio-political orientations within European societies. After a good deal of discussion, we have identified the following three socio-political attitude scales that the ESS should consider measuring: left-right orientation, libertarian-authoritarian orientation, and environmentalism. In doing so, we have already taken into account the fact that the following value orientations are already covered in the core module. So they're already trying to triangulate their proposals against existing information. And this is important in a proposal because if you're just doing your one little thing out there on your own, that's cool for you. But if you can find ways of saying, well, if you give me space on this in questionnaire, not only will you get value of money for this new information I'm going to bring, but I'm going to be able to connect it to other things that you're already paying for in your survey. And other people then can link up, people who are working on these other issues can also look at this new data and incorporate it into their estimates and their modeling and their analysis. So again, it's just very smart from a proposal point of view to be able to show how the work you're going to do is going to get more value for the buck, as it were. In doing so, we have already taken into account the fact that the following value orientations are already covered in the core module. Oh, the other thing too is you want to demonstrate an awareness of what questions are already being asked, because if your question is quite similar to a question on post-materialism, you're asking people in the questionnaire to just waste time on a question they've already asked. So you want to make sure that the things that you're covering aren't already covered by the theoretical framework. So these are all just very tactical things to think about when you're writing a grant proposal or one of these kinds of proposals about exactly where your stuff fits, how it fits with other people, what it can link up with, what's new about it, and how, value for the buck. So the core values already asked about are post-materialism, basic human values, satisfaction with democracy, trust in institutions, confidence in the economy, interest in politics, party affiliation and voting turnout, personal and system efficiencies, efficacies, religious adherence, church attendance and belief in God, and finally, national sentiment. We are not yet in a position to recommend the exact items which should be included within each of the proposed scales. Rather, in the following sections, we outline the ways in which similar scales have been constructed in previous studies, some pan-European, some national. Our next stage must be to test the workability and reliability of these existing items within the context of ESS participating nations. Data for this will be provided by inclusion of more items rather than less within the ESS pilot. We need to investigate the reliability of the various items and their ability to combine to form scales which are not only robust and reliable, but are also proven to measure the dimensions in which we are interested in. I think I've told you before that when you want to measure one concept, the more questions you can ask about one concept, the better. People in psychology will devote like 9 or 10 questions to a single concept. And they might want to ask, like when I was looking at the personal attributes questionnaire, they might want to look at 3 concepts. You're looking at, 24 questions or, 27 questions just to get 3 concepts. And if that's a long time to just answer questions on one thing, and there's only so much room. The other common practice in social surveys is to run a pilot. So you don't want to just go out with some questions that you're trying out for the first time and stick them in your... I mean, it's a little bit different now with the internet, but even with the internet, it's just good practice to pilot your questions. You take some questions you think are going to work, and you're like, okay, and this is what I did. I'm going to ask, I can't ask all 24 questions in the personal attributes questionnaire in a main survey. So I'm going to do some research in the field. I don't even think it was 24. I think initially the personal attributes question was much longer. And I had done research that found people who had looked at the survey and said, actually, we don't need these questions because they don't really help us, even though they worked with a crosstab. They don't really work with a factor or confirmatory factor analysis. So we were able to reduce the questionnaire down to these 24 questions, down from however many it was, I don't remember. And then I took those and put them in a pilot. And from that pilot, I found the ones that were best able to predict the concepts that I wanted to work with, because I had to get that list from 24 down to 9. And in a pilot phase, you're not looking to produce necessarily the best data. What you want is a sample so that you can look at your measures and you can do tests on how your measures perform. Because if you can't have confidence that what your questions, the responses that they're providing will actually get you a scale that you can use or an answer that you can use, then you're just wasting everyone's time. So it is always a good idea to ask more questions, the full battery of questions, and then from that you can go, okay, well, these 2 questions they don't have the kind of differences that we want to measure, or they don't load as high on the factor analysis, whatever your metrics are. I'm only 1 coffee in and I'm kind of doing this on the fly. I'm assuming that I'm not getting a lot of you talking in the chat because you're just using me as a podcast. But so I'm just saying hi. All right, so let's actually now get down to their questions. That's all set up for their questions. Yeah, so we'll see what I'll go through this a little bit faster. Where are the actual questions that they have? Oh my gosh, this is much longer than I remember. All right, well, I'll just do the first paragraph on left-right, and then we'll look at their questions. So, it is widely accepted that a key value orientation in most, if not all, Western democracies comprises of a left-right or libertarian-conservative continuum. This dimension is widely thought to be at the heart of differences in social and political attitudes between the middle and working classes. It is commonly found to be correlated with both party identification and voting behavior. Meanwhile, European societies are often found to exhibit greater support for left-right values than do Anglo-American societies or Japan. I was tempted to, okay. You guys can just listen. That's fine. I know I'm not really interacting. So, I want to get, I should have skimmed this. I forgot it was like 6 pages long when I pulled it up. There are in fact, back to the topic. There are in fact 2 related but distinct elements of left-right values. One is sympathy or otherwise greater economic equality in society. The other is sympathy or otherwise for greater economic equality. The other is sympathy or otherwise for government intervention in the operation of the market. For simplicity, we refer to these 2 elements as egalitarianism and interventionism, respectively. These 2 elements are usually found to be correlated with each other. Thus, for those, for example, who favor greater equality of incomes, are also usually found to be more likely to believe that the government should own and run key industries. So while it is important that any left-right scale include items that capture both elements and their intercorrelation is assessed, it is not clear that 2 separate scales will be required. If you have some 2 concepts that seem kind of different, but they're so interlinked as to be almost like a function of a replacement for each other, then the question becomes for efficiency in the survey, do I really need to ask about both these dimensions? Let's say that we had a situation in the United States where your religiosity, let's just okay, I'm going to make something up. This isn't true, all right? But let's say the more sort of like evangelical Christian, if you were an evangelical Christian, that could almost perfectly predict your support for the death penalty. This is not true. And you're already going to ask about a socio-demographic question on people's religion anyway. So if you know that there's just this clear long-term public opinion-based link between being an evangelical and supporting the death penalty and everybody else doesn't, then do you really need the kind of space on there? I'm not saying you could make up people's answers, but that's actually kind of not the... I guess you could use an evangelical identity as a replacement on issues of something else. It's not a great example, but I think you guys get the meaning. You're just fascinated. Oh, I love you guys. Trans Grammar Girl's like, I'm fascinated by the topic. I love when you guys get geeky with me. That's so sexy. Right. Okay, inter alia, this value orientation, this is of the intercorrelation between egalitarianism and interventionism, is expected to be related to attitudes toward the welfare state, the role of trade unions, and the need for progressive taxation. They don't say it, but the implication is the more you favor equal incomes and also believe government should own and run key industries, we would also then predict you would have more favorable attitudes toward the welfare state, you would have more favorable attitudes toward the role of trade unions, and also for progressive taxation. These issues cluster together ideologically. And the reverse, if you had more, not egalitarianism, but you were more willing to tolerate, I don't know, they don't really have the opposite of egalitarianism, so I'm not sure what phrase they use. But basically, if you're willing to tolerate inequality, then, and you also thought the government should stay out, we would predict you would have the opposite views. And then what they do here is they go through other examples, previous attempts to form left-right scales to measure these concepts. And then they review some of them here. In the EVS, the European Value Survey, using factor analysis, Knudsen combined 1990 data to test whether a common left-right value orientation could be identified in 13 European countries. He found that 5 items all had high loadings and on the same dimension in 10 of the 13 countries. Let me stop. Factor analysis is a way that we look at a series of questions to see how well the answers in the set correlate with each other. It's been a long time since I've actually had to dust off my notes on factor analysis, but basically, the core concept is, if you're measuring one idea, or you're measuring like a dichotomy of ideas, like just an on-off kind of thing, you ask people a bunch of questions. All of the answers that are designed to measure that thing, let's say you're asking about economic equality, and you ask a series of questions about society and economic equality. In a series of questions designed to measure that, people who value equality should answer all the questions in the same way. Now, if it's a 5-point scale, a Likert scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree, not everyone is going to say strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, but they should generally tend toward like strongly agree, strongly, and agree. We look to see what extent these remember the question should be worded in opposite directions, so then you've got to flip the orientation. You make the negative positive so that you can all have, like, everything should be 5. And then people should answer consistently, and not just individuals. The entire sample you have should all, if you're measuring something, if something is being measured, it should all basically correlate with itself. And the way that we analyze that is through something called a factor analysis. And what a factor analysis kind of does is it tries to it has a cutoff. How do I describe this? If all of the answers are clustering in the right way, you should be able to do something where we have like a loading that these answers all correlate with each other. And not only do they correlate with each other, we have a threshold, usually depending on the sample size of they correlate at 0.7 or higher. Now, perfect correlation is 1. It is almost impossible for a group of people to all answer the questions in such a way that you get a factor loading of 1. So we tend to have a cutoff, smaller samples, maybe a 0.5, and then you can kind of rank order. So if you have a series, maybe I can show you a factor analysis sometime. But if you have like 3 of your 5 questions, all of the answers are so close that they correlate with each other, to the point where you get an estimate of, like, let's say 0.720 correlation. And then you've got another set of questions that correlate not with the first set, but with a sort of another cluster of answers. You would say that has a 2-factor loading. You've got 2 things going on there that people are responding to. And when we want to measure a single concept, we want to measure a single concept. We don't want what's called cross-loading. We don't want our answers to pick up on 2 things. So we look at how well the responses correlate with each other in order to find the ones that kind of cluster together to measure the concept we want. And that is a way to that is a way to filter out questions that perform less efficiently. And so they say here that they had 5, I don't know how many questions the Knudsen had in this test, but he said 5 items, by items he means questions, all had high loadings on the same dimension. And that's to say, 5 questions all had a good internal correlation with each other on the dimension that we wanted to measure in 10 of the 13 countries. And we talked about context before. It's hard for these concepts to travel identically across countries. So when you get that, you have a pretty efficient metric when you want to do a pan-European survey. 10 of the 13 is pretty good. You're not going to, things are hard to measure. So the question then becomes, how much error do you want to tolerate? And are there other ways to capture those other 3 countries? So this will help a little bit. So let me go back to the beginning. He found that 5 items all had high loadings on the same dimension in 10 of the 13 countries, while 3 of those items also loaded together on the same dimension in the other 3 countries. So it looks like, 5 of them had high loadings in the same dimension, and 3 of them had loadings on the same dimension in the other countries. So all the items included are double-sided scales. So it looks like in the other 3 countries, it looks like whatever scale this is between the 5 of them, or 5 of them did on 10, and then 3 of them did on the other, and they're all meant to be measuring the same thing. Without actually seeing the analysis, I'm kind of losing the plot here, but I think I have that right. All of the items are double-sided scales, thus should be free from acquiescence bias. Scoring from 1 to 10, the scale covering the following dimensions were: I'd like you to tell me your various views. How would you place yourself on this scale? Economic equality. Income should be made more equal on a scale of 1 to 10. Versus there should be greater incentives for individual effort. So those are the 2 questions that they put to try to capture the concept of economic equality. Nationalization. Private ownership of business and industry should be increased. Versus government ownership of business and industry should be increased. Individual versus public responsibility. Individuals should take more responsibility for providing for themselves. Versus the state should take more responsibility to ensure that everyone is provided for. And then B, C, and D lay on the same dimensions in all countries. If you guys are interested, I'm going to go down. Let's just look at the questions that they propose. I did not plan to go this long. Here's their proposal. Although there are 2 elements of the left-right continuum, egalitarianism and interventionism, we have found empirically that they are highly correlated. Therefore, one scale should accommodate both elements. This is parsimony in your survey construction. There's no point in wasting questions asking 2 different sets of questions when you can pretty much count on the correlation of these concepts to allow you to just do the one and make inferences about the other. We propose testing the following items. A number of them overlap, and thus choices should be made after analysis of the pilot data. The first 3 items are to measure the egalitarian element, the next 2, the interventionism element. They're proposing a 7-point scale rather than a 10-point scale. We didn't really talk about the number of options and also like the pros and cons, but I think a 7-point scale, 1 to 10, I don't really know that people know the difference between a 7 and an 8. Likert scale, I can see the argument of it's being a little bit of a rough instrument, and people tend to hide in the 3s if you force them. Whereas on a 7-point scale, people might spread their answers out a bit more so they don't get the clustering in the center. That's a little bit of speculation on my part, but I can see why for an international survey, 7 might make more sense than forcing people into basically a binary of agree or disagree, and then how intensely they agree or disagree. So their wording is, it is not the government's role to redistribute income from the better off to the worse off. To what extent do you agree or disagree with that? It is the government's responsibility to provide a job for everyone who wants one. Management will always get the better of employees if given the chance. It's interesting that one's really withstood the test of time. I think that's quite an old, not an old worded question, but a long-running question. I think it taps deeply into the suspicion that underpins capitalism. Private enterprise is the best way to solve Britain's economic problems, or fill in the country there. And major public services and industries ought to be in state ownership. That's it. Sorry, I don't mean to keep coughing at you guys. I feel so bad every time I cough. All right, what time are we? I did not plan on doing this for like a half an hour. I feel like I've been going a half hour. Yes, and I have. All right, let's tell you what. Let's do a little bit on libertarian authoritarian orientations, similar, just to give you guys the theoretical background of what happens with political scientists and what we're thinking. Then we can take a bit of a break because I'm going to have some coffee. I'm going to try to see if I can make my voice sound a little less froggy. And maybe in the second part of it, we can watch a PragerU video, or you guys can throw some questions at me and have a bit more of a chat. Right. So from their proposal, the second part of it, the libertarian authoritarian orientations part. Here is their theoretical starting point. It has been widely argued that the most important value orientation to cut across the left-right dimension is a libertarian authoritarian one. Those who have a more libertarian view believe that individuals should largely be free to make their own moral choices, emphasizing the importance of self-actualization and self-expression, and accept the merits of cultural pluralism. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, TGG. In contrast, those with a more authoritarian view believe that society should uphold certain common moral and cultural standards, and thus they are prepared to accept some limitation on personal freedom for the greater good of maintaining a cohesive and secure society. It's interesting that, I'm going to take a little pause out of this, that you could really think about the authoritarian view. If you define it as society should uphold certain common moral and cultural standards, one might say that from a progressive point of view, back this up. We tend to associate authoritarianism with authoritarian views with authoritarianism, saying that the government tells you what to think. I think of religious, like evangelical Christianity, as being quite authoritarian in that it wants to impose its cultural values and its norms and its perspectives on other people in order to uphold their common moral cultural standards. Everyone else has to adhere to it. But on the other hand, as a person on the left, I would say that our society should uphold some common moral standards and common moral and cultural standards. So am I prepared to accept hate speech laws so that people have a level of, if not protection, then recourse if their lives are destroyed because of other people's bigotry? Yeah, I think that there is some level of saying, hate speech laws are very, very controversial. But the extent to which someone clearly is attacking another person because of a characteristic about them, that's different from an opportunistic crime or a crime of passion. There is a forethought, there is a deliberation to that. The intent of those words, that harassment, that behavior is to instill fear and terror and to destroy the quality of that person's life. And should we just tolerate that under the guise of free speech? Should I have to go around, whoever, I've got super privilege, I got all kinds of privilege. But as, let's say, people recognized me as an immigrant in Germany, should I have to live my entire life in fear of going outdoors, which I don't, because people are going to come up to me and harass me for being an immigrant? Is the benefit, is our society better off when part of the population lives in terror? So to what extent is authoritarian really a right-wing view, or is it, I don't want to say a left-wing view, but we all have a certain perspective on what it means to live in a society that has moral standards and a culture that reflects those moral standards. So I'm just kind of riffing a little bit here on these concepts, that it's not, even though it's being put in as kind of a left-right framework, there are ways that we can think about these attitudes or these perspectives from more than just a left-wing or right-wing perspective. All right. People's placement on this continuum helps to predict their attitudes to traditional law and order issues to do with crime and punishment. And this, again, is a framing way. Here they're saying is people who are more in favor of, let's say, punishing criminals, we're going to measure them as more authoritarian. But if you put in there, I will be willing to accept limits on speech for that is targeted toward certain types of minorities or vulnerable groups, I would say yes to that, for instance. So how we think about the concept of authoritarian will influence the interpretation of the data. And if you just look at it not knowing that, you might get a wrong idea. To issues to do with crime and punishment, to moral issues such as abortion, and social issues such as immigration. Those who are well educated and of a secular disposition tend to adopt libertarian views. So again, this is like kind of old school white privilege thinking, while those who are less well educated or religious tend to be more authoritarian. So their perspective, again, this kind of feeds, I'm not saying it's wrong. How they're conceptualizing this has been pretty consistently used and is empirically observable. I'm just saying that we can reimagine some of these things in order to capture ways in which it works from different perspectives, like from a left perspective. The dimension thus helps capture the values behind the traditional religious cleavage found in many European politics, as well as elements of purported post-materialist attitudes from Engelhardt and Bryson and Curtis. Authoritarianism is its own axis, though, did fall out of love with a certain historian who sees authoritarianism as exclusively a left-wing phenomenon. I think it is. I can understand where you're coming from. If we think about authoritarian as, if we locate it conceptually within, let's say, religious conformity, evangelical religious conformity, or people who have quite a punitive view of crime and punishment, and therefore, or people who are more interested in national security and are willing to, say, give up some individual liberty in order for the state to be, or the state to be able to operate so that we're safe. That's kind of one form of, we could conceptualize authoritarianism. If we think about, let's say, authoritarian from a more, I don't want to say communist, because I don't think what happened in the Soviet Union or in China is, I mean, it works economically, but they, authoritarianism from that perspective of the state intervening from a collective framework as opposed to, say, from a Christian moralization framework. You could also set up a series of questions that probably measure authoritarianism and attitudes towards accepting it or not in Chinese society or in former Soviet, now Russian society and Eastern Bloc societies. I think part of the problem is, like, how do you define it? What perspective are you trying to capture? What is the sort of historical location of authoritarianism in that context? So people in the United States, for instance, might be far more willing to, white people in the United States might be far more willing to say yes to questions about the role of the police state than, like, someone honestly in an authoritarian country because of the way that it's being used. So I think what is important to take away from this is we need to know what is the definitions being used, what is the context of the question being asked, and what are people trying to measure? If you just take a word like authoritarianism, you could probably come up, like I said, with a scale for showing that the right wing is authoritarian or the left wing is authoritarian. So the issue isn't the word, the issue there is what is underneath it. Like, what are the questions really asking, and what do the questions assume about the concept itself? And that's part of the reason why political scientists, not only do we exist in a little bit of a bubble because we have all of this literature that precedes us, but our framing of these questions is always going to be linked to and anchored by the questions when they were developed. So this really reflects, I think, a lot of the 1960s, 70s thinking. And we're kind of stuck with it now. And sometimes questions withstand the test of time, and sometimes they don't. All right. So let's look at their different measures of libertarian authoritarianism orientation. So far, we have found few studies which have successfully tapped this orientation. I wonder why. We've just talked about why. It sounds simple, but when you actually unpack it, it's a lot more complicated. A lot further work will be needed in the development of a libertarianism scale for the ESS. None of the examples we given have been fielded in any more than one country, with the possible exception of the Adorno scale. I don't even know what the Adorno scale is. All right, so from the British election study, which I worked on, has developed a scale designed to measure this orientation, though it has a rather lower Cronbach's alpha than the equivalent left-right scale. All right, so Cronbach's alpha is the way that you measure the scales. I don't want to say quality. You want a higher Cronbach's alpha. It shows more internal consistency. As you see here, though, the Cronbach's alpha of 0.50 or 0.65, I told you about 5 kind of being a cutoff when you look at factor analysis and the way that these scales internally measure the same concept. What they're saying here is this scale, and it's inherited from the 1970s. It doesn't have the same internal correlation and consistency as the left-right scale. Left-right is, if you have the questions, you're able to better, the questions correlate better with each other. You're measuring more of the same concept. And with this set of questions, there's a bit more variation. So the quality seems to be a little bit lower, but it still kind of measures it enough. Is right. And I think you can probably look at, I would imagine that the homosexual relations are always wrong question in this battery really throws the entire grouping off, because homosexual relations in the 1970s, when I assume that this was about the right time, about the time that this was put in there, was a very clear left-right issue. And people who were religiously opposed to it wanted to use the power of the state to enforce their religious views. And therefore, people who were more left or liberal in they wanted to kind of like free people from, state rule or state interference, there would be a clear division. But that left-right division is kind of gone now. So I would imagine that one question in particular brings the entire scale down. But they ask, I know these questions, the 5-point scale from agree to strongly agree to strongly disagree. Young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values. Censorship of films and magazines is necessary to uphold moral standards. Homosexual relations are always wrong. People in Britain should be more tolerant of those who lead unconventional lives. People should be able to organize public meetings to protest against the government. And finally, political parties that wish to overthrow wish to overthrow democracy should be allowed to stand in general elections. I think the unconventional lifestyle one and the homosexual always being wrong one is probably the biggest problem with that battery now these days. It just doesn't measure the things that it used to measure because people's attitudes have changed. Public opinion is a moving target, and we're stuck with the same wording, decade on decade. All right, so we'll literally just take a here. Let me just look at your comments in the chat. Oh, my coffee machine just turned itself off. No, I wanted you. I wanted more of you. Authoritarianism is its own axis. Oh, yes, I've read about that one already. Like Ben Shapiro thinking he should be able to have freedom of belief, expression, and speech about LGBTQ plus people, but heaven forbid a woman of color sing about her WAP. Yes, it's all about my freedoms and not about yours, precisely. So much for consistency of position, yes. Sid Wolf, I'm thinking authoritarianism is a centralization of power in a relatively small sphere, whether it's a church or government seeking top-down structures of society. Peter says, right-leaning, who are maybe not religious but might be considered softer toward Christianity, people who make it out as if authoritarianism is all bad. These types of people often bother me. I think the fuzziness around authoritarianism is that it was perhaps conceptualized in its own time period against sort of like the Soviet Union and Chinese communism at the time, not its sort of state capitalism that it practices now. And as a consequence, I guess I would have to do more of the reading into this research and the concept of authoritarianism, but it does seem to be obviously a serious tension between allowing people to do what they want and for instance, like, should we allow parties that want to overthrow democracy to be allowed to go out and campaign? Can we be so liberal in our approach to free speech that we're actually willing to put the democracy that allows us our free speech up for debate and possibly for overthrow? And where do we have the line? And that's the paradox, isn't it, that what's his name talked about? Was it Popper? Popper's paradox of tolerance or something? I can't remember. You guys in the chat will remember. But okay. So let's just see what they propose. The Adorno scale, in the 1950s. There are two sorts of people, the strong and the weak. Dodgy. Most people fall short of your expectations when you get to know them better. Young people often revolt against social situations they find unjust. However, when they get older, they ought to become resigned to reality. Oh, that's a terrible question. It's not... Okay, so this was in the 1950s. In the 1950s, they hadn't had a lot of opportunity to test questions out. But that is a classic double barrel. Double barrel questions when you asked about two things in the same question. Young people often revolt against social situations they find unjust. You might agree with that. You might disagree with that. That's an entirely, like, young people might revolt against other stuff. I don't know. Then, however, when they get older, they ought to become resigned to reality is a completely different question. So if you say, yes, I agree, but, well, I agree with the first, but I don't agree. Like, how do you answer that? Anyway, most of our problems would be solved if we could just somehow get rid of the immoral, crooked, and feeble-minded people. Who the heck wrote these questions? These are awful. What we need are fewer laws and institutions and more courageous, tireless, devoted leaders whom people can trust. Ill-mannered people cannot expect decent people to want to mix with them. There's a reason why I've never heard of the Adorno scale, and there's a reason I've never heard these questions, because nobody uses this anymore. Ill-mannered people cannot expect decent people to want to mix with them. Did I get that one already? Nowadays, more and more people are prying into matters that should remain personal and private. And that's the summary of this, of what the authors of this paper write is, the wording of many of these items would certainly be problematic within the context of the ASS. That is some academic shade right there. Like, you don't necessarily catch that, but calling wording problematic, that's some shade. All right, so what they propose is, I guess what happens is, the people who think homosexuality is wrong are so consistent in their beliefs that even if they're only a small part of a population, the fact that you get this core kind of, like, I think ends up resulting in it being carried over. And maybe it's my liberal bias. Maybe I forget the extent to which, living in a Western liberal society, I know homophobia is rampant in Eastern Europe. And so this is where the context is important. A friend of mine does analysis into the relationship between secularism and homophobia, or the lack thereof. We tend to assume, like at least I did from an American perspective, that atheism and secularism is associated with more liberal views towards sexuality, sexual identity. And in our context, it's true. However, in the Eastern Bloc countries, you had kind of this sort of attack on religion, you had an undermining of religion, you had certainly a lower adherence to religious beliefs, religious identification, and lower attendance in church services. But for all of that secularization and the de-emphasis of the role of the church in society, homophobia is just, like, raging comparatively. So that it isn't enough for you to be a secular society or have a majority of people who identify as secular or a low religiosity in the aggregate. There doesn't produce acceptance or tolerance. And that was something that I thought was really, I don't want to say interesting, insightful. Because it wasn't something I had reflected on from a humanist perspective or an atheist perspective, because I came from America, where if you started to unpack religion, you kind of undermined the basis for that kind of bigotry. But because it's tied to masculinity, and authoritarians really love their toxic masculinity, it is perpetuated in Eastern Bloc countries. Hey, Lonely Wolf, and hi, Eva. Hello. Did I say hi to Striped Mongoose already? All right, so let's look at the questions that they propose. These look very much similar to me from the British election study. And they are, okay, again, the following criteria above, we have revisited what was originally a long list of possible items. We have tried to select the best examples for each of the 5 elements of the libertarian-authoritarian scale. In some cases, we have played around with the wording in order to aid cross-national comprehension and to provide a balanced list of positive and negative statements. Our suggestions are: how strongly do you agree or disagree with the following items? Young people should be taught to respect authority. If you remember, we went up before, there was something about young people don't have enough respect for. So that makes sense in terms of the wording, because it asks less about people's perceptions of what's happening in society versus asking people what they think should happen. Does that make sense? In case it doesn't, let me just compare these two wordings. Where'd it go? Young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values is asking what people think about what is happening in society relative to what they think should happen. So you're asking them to make an empirical judgment about the current times you're living in. And that assessment of the current times is going to change based on what kind of people's perceptions of it are. So that you're asking people, again, to kind of like make an assessment about the world. When you phrase it as young people should be taught to respect authority, then you're tapping into the respondent's value system. You're not asking them to make an evaluation of what they think is happening in society. It's a subtle difference, maybe, but empirically, when you're measuring a concept, it's an important one, because we're not interested in what people think is happening in society. We want to know what they think should happen in society. So that, I think, is a really good rewording of that question. It makes it much more efficient. Hello, Bruce. There is nothing wrong in homosexuality. That's an interesting reframing of the same question. Because if we looked up at the way it was wording before, it was really normative. Homosexual relations are always wrong. And that, just putting that out there puts people on the defensive. It's assuming something. And I get why, like in my head, this is probably written by straight people who didn't really think about the impact of this question on its respondents. It was written in the 1970s, probably, or I could go back and check the actual dates, but that sounds about right. And if you live in a little straight bubble, asking gay and bi respondents, you're saying to them, homosexual relations are always wrong. You're immediately saying that to, so this rewording, again, it's tapping into the, maybe the toxic masculinity dimension or into the religious dimension. But, oh my God, one of the questions was homosexuals should be eradicated from society? Freaking hell. This is terrible. The homophobia. I didn't study. Sorry, I'm kind of like live reacting here because libertarian authoritarianism as a scale was always something I just replicated. I tried to find questions to replicate in order to be able to control for the theoretical concepts in my models. But holy crap, there was blatant homophobia in these questionnaires before. When they say problematic, they're not kidding. So saying there is nothing wrong in homosexuality is almost like reversing it and taking the opposite end of the pole, which when you have legalized marriage equality, you can't just be telling people that stuff is wrong. So, yeah, wow. Eye-opener for me. Maybe there's an entire thesis in there about the pervasive, no, probably not a whole thesis, probably couldn't, but maybe an article self-reflectively examining the decades of homophobia and bigotry inherent in the framing of the questions and the effects on respondents. Whew. Sorry, I was a little bit... Yeah, so if they probably were asking the questions in the mid-90s, but the wording, I would imagine, goes back. Libertarian authoritarianism is a much older concept that people were trying to tap into. And, I guess when we got the thing right here, we can probably go up and look at some of the dates. They do a good job on their referencing. Let's see. British election study, I know the British election study started running in 1964. I don't know if this was the original scale. That would I'd have to check. Do they have dates on, talking about Englehart, Flanagan, and Lee? Okay, so some of these were in the late 80s, but I don't know if this is parents. Yeah, fucking hell. Sorry, I try not to swear on this show, but, Middendorp, again, never heard of this person. Clearly, why, is clear now. And the Adorno scale is from the 1950s. I don't know if it mentions homosexuality specifically, but anyway, we got to get rid of those questions. Okay, so there's nothing wrong in homosexuality. Censorship of films and magazines is necessary to uphold moral standards. People who propose overthrowing democracy should be free to stand in national elections. And finally, the law should always be obeyed, even when a particular law is felt to be wrong. That is tapping into a kind of authoritarianism. I guess we would probably put it on the political right. These are all framed with the assumption authoritarian is a right-wing proposition, or so. Yeah, and then they talk about environmentalism. Well, Section 28 is still in force. Does reflect the attitudes from this time. I can't speak to that. I'll have to defer to the expertise of others on that. Transracial girl. So that off the top of my head, I will have to defer on that section. Not my area of expertise. So I'll just admit ignorance and let someone who knows more say more. Oh my gosh. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of Manitowoc Minute, which I want to do a little shout out if you guys. There we go. I've kind of like been squashed down, and I should sit up more properly here. If you guys want some mental vacation, so I'm going to take a break here. I need to refill my coffee. My voice, I think, is finally cleared. It only takes like an hour for my voice to finally start to. I should just like sing along or rap Hamilton or something for an hour before the show. But if you want a little a little mental holiday, a little sweet break, a mental escapism, I can highly recommend Charlie Barron's, his channel here. He's from Wisconsin. He does a really over-the-top Wisconsin accent. He talks about life in Wisconsin and, for instance, like how to make a perfect Bloody Mary with horseradish and Tabasco sauce and Worcestershire sauce and then pickled onions and pickled mushrooms and celery and, well, I've seen bacon in it and lots of other things. So if you need going to rap Hamilton, can you do DeValiant? I liked it. Yeah, you can do Lafayette. I'm taking these horse by the reins, making red coats rudder with blood stains. And I'm never going to stop until I make them drop and burn them up and scatter the remains. It's been a while since I've done that one. But yeah, Daveed Diggs has some of the best lines in there. We tell you what, we can do a cabinet battle. We can do cabinet battle number 1 or number 2. Lucky Wanderer. And then you can do Diggs. Daveed Diggs. DD. All right. Yeah, you guys have a bit of a chat in the chat if you want. I talked about left-right scales. I guess we're going to talk... Oh, that was it. I was going to talk about the U.S. We spent so much time going over the background stuff. Completely forgot to talk about it in the U.S. context. But I'm also getting really tired. I had a long night last night. I'm struggling today with a little bit of health problems I don't want to get into. And, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals, we shouldn't settle for less. These are wise words, enterprising men quote 'em. Don't act surprised, you guys, 'cause I wrote 'em. Ow! Someone photoshopped Ben Shapiro's face on Cardi B's WAP. Is that appropriate for the happy hour? We might have to get that up. All right. Yep. It's time for you to get ice cream. It's time for us to take a break. Let's go back to the music and we'll make the decisions after the break. I'll have time to think about it and maybe set myself up a bit more professionally. All right. So see you all in a few. Oh, I have to turn the music up. That would help. am back. I see Drayon's Gamer Girl has a correction in the chat, so I know that I always appreciate it when someone checks me if I've got a misunderstanding, because we're ultimately interested in accuracy here. So thank you for checking that out. Section 28 was repealed in Scotland in 2000 and the rest of the UK in 2003. They took them a 3-year. There was a 3-year lag there. But that is now officially in the record, so noted. And also, yeah, Sybil, if you want to do, you have some shelves to put off, like you've been putting up the shelves, putting the shelves up, your office is starting to come together. Congrats, that's great. Life, liberty, don't act surprised I plagiarized Locke. Yeah, precisely. It was so blatant as well. And yeah, DN fan, if you ever hear me talking about leaving, you've got another 10 minutes at least, because that's a very much a Wisconsin tradition. I don't know if it's in the rest of the world, but you're like, okay, well, I should probably get going, and then you talk and talk and talk. Also, despite my best efforts, I have I had the curls going on. Oh, you can see, there's the one going. There's the other. It's hard to see, I think, on camera. Oh, maybe I can make the bigger 2 camera. Yeah, oh yeah, you can totally see the flips in the hair there and there. I got the flippies. Despite my best efforts, I could tuck it behind my ears, but then I just look like Prince Valiant. And so it kind of loses the effect of having a 20s bob. So we're just going to go with the flippies. We're just going to let my curls be their curls. It's weird because the ones in the back, you know, they all hang down nicely like they're meant to. It's just these. It's just these guys. Right. Oh, damn, I was going to organize some stuff before the show. All right, it's okay. I can go into my histories because I know what I want to look at because I looked it up online beforehand. I sing you guys little songs. Yeah, I think it was the political attitudes and values. Pew has some really good stuff. I tried to look up on Gallup, but I didn't have enough time this morning because I slept in. I did a lot of gaming last night. I don't know if you guys saw on my channel. I've got a dedicated gaming channel now because D&D is my therapy. D&D is my escapism. And it's, yeah, I can go a little bit self-indulgent here and talk. It's kind of one thing to escape into film and maybe also into video games. Online video games, I guess, are more interactive if you're on a sort of a multiplayer scenario or situation. You get to interact with people. But just consuming like news all day and even watching YouTube channels or Netflix or Prime, any of that, it's very solitary. And the nice thing about D&D is you actually get to talk to other human beings during a pandemic. And so I'm definitely been enjoying it, and I've rediscovered my love for the game in the last year, I guess. And yeah, so I'm going to be doing that. Well, we'll see how long. Maybe a year, maybe 5 years, maybe for the rest of my life. Who knows? And yeah, we're going to do a long-term campaign. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm looking over the class and I'm impressed, by the way. One of the classes suggested for somebody in the longer campaign. And by the time we do the longer campaign, I will get it organized on Twitch, so that people who want to follow it there can follow it there. Yeah, so one of the things, now moving back to more of a topic, one of the things that I do think people who follow politics understand, but I don't know how much it works into their calculations, is that compared to European countries, because it's only this is only meaningful in terms of comparisons. You can't say these things in terms of an objective measure. So relative to their European counterparts, Americans are more suspicious of government programs. Americans have more faith in capitalism. And Americans in the aggregate, not individual Americans, but Americans as a whole, have much higher degrees of religiosity. I think these are the 3 main factors that lead to Americans being a more center-right country overall. So what did I say? I remember the last one. I should write these down. This is basically like support for taxation in order to provide public services, belief in capitalism as a way to kind of solve economic problems, and religiosity. Now, I want to look a little bit at this the idea of a universal income, I would hope I think there's a lot of pros that there's a lot of advantages. They're actually starting a study. I am free associating. This is Christy during Stream of Consciousness. Germany, UBI. My aunt wrote me a message saying, "Is this true?" She sent me a message from businessmarket.com or market-something.com. I can't remember. We'll look at this one. Yeah, Germany's decided to do a trial of universal basic income. There's one country, I think it's like Luxembourg, that definitely has a universal basic income, but there hasn't been, to my mind, or to my understanding based on reading this, a controlled experiment where they follow a group of people for a series of years, providing one group with universal basic income and the other without, to see how it changes their behavior. Because you can't, if you institute it nationwide, you're not gonna really be able to control for anything. You're not gonna have a control group. So let's just have a look at this. It says, sure. Oh, fine. Where's my blog? Get off this. Don't block ads. Refresh. Okay. This was published on the 21st of August. Was that yesterday or the day before? Oh my God. This pop-up, that pop-up. 2 days ago. Today's the 23rd. A group of people are to receive 1,200 euros, a universal basic income per month for 3 years in a new German study. Germany is launching a new trial to find out how universal basic income affects the attitudes and lives of those who receive it. As part of the pilot project Grundeinkommen, Pilotprojekt Grundeinkommen, or pilot project for basic income, 120 people will receive 1,200 a month euros for 3 years. Researchers will compare their experiences with another group of 1,380 people who will not receive the cash. It is being run by the German Institute for Economic Research and Mein Grundeinkommen, My Basic Income, a startup based in Berlin which has been giving opportunities to people for 1-year payments of 1,000 per month for 6 years now. Why is it being carried out? The aim is to gain a scientific understanding of... Sorry, my fan is going on my computer and I can hear it. Oh, you guys can't hear it. Fortunately, it's drowned out for you. Good. The aim is to gain a scientific understanding of how people's attitudes and behaviors change when they receive money regularly without conditions, reports Spiegel, who interviewed one of the researchers. Do those people receive it become lazy or creative? Do they shorten their working hours or give up their jobs altogether? Do they use the extra time and money only for themselves, or do they get involved with communities for the benefit of society? Researchers want to find 1 million applicants by November. A total of 20,000 people will be randomly selected and extensively interviewed about their life situation. From that group, 1,500 will be selected for the 3-year income experiment. A total of 120 will receive the basic income, and 1,380 who will get no money will form a comparison group. It's scheduled to kick off next spring. Schupp said the research group wants to discover how a reliable, unconditional flow of money affects people's attitudes and behaviors. He said, "We are the first to examine the basic income in this way and at this level. Academics want a real mix of people to take part." Schupp said it was important that some people in the sample are rather negative towards the basic income, so as to not distort the results from the outset. What value will the study have to society? Schupp said that current debate on basic income is currently not really based on hard evidence. This study aims to provide empirically proven knowledge to aid the debate on introducing universal basic income. Quote, opponents claim that with a basic income, people would stop working in order to lie on the couch with fast food and streaming services, unquote. Proponents argue that people will continue to do fulfilling work, becoming more creative and charitable, and save democracy. That might be a stretch too far. Bye, DN. DN fan. By the way, we can improve this debate if we replace these stereotypes with empirically proven knowledge. How is it being funded? The project already has attracted 1,040 140,000 private donors. It's also brought on a board of renowned scientists, including behavioral economists, psychologists, and public welfare researchers. So I think that this is a good way to go. We can talk and speculate a lot about how people are going to behave. The limits on the study is that if they are made up of people who reside in Germany or grew up in Germany or are residents of Germany for a long time, they're going to reflect the kind of cultural attitudes that German society has. So I don't know how generalizable it will be, and maybe I'm too optimistic about human nature, but I think that $1,200 a month is not really enough to comfortably live on. When you talk about having, my place in Cologne is pretty small, and I have I've been locked into my rent, locked into the price of my rent since I moved in 2012, because I signed a contract that said that, so in Germany, your rent is supposed to be fixed, but your Nebenkosten, your utilities can fluctuate. But the way the contract was written, it was only the guy who was renting this out kind of had a furnished apartment for, he thought a year at a time. And I just signed an ongoing contract and then just never moved out. So my rent has never gone up, which is quite unusual. Probably if I were to rent this place now, it would be more expensive. It would certainly, right now, this would be half my income would just be rent. So you can't, unless you lived in a Wohngemeinschaft with a bunch of other people and, you only ate rice and you added beans and carrots and other veg to it, it would be pretty difficult to get by on $1,200 a month. But with $1,200 a month, you could work in a lower, a waitressing job or something else and not have to try to get by on basically that equivalent. So I personally think that people would continue to work. Even if you took 6 months off, eventually you would get bored. There would have to be something. It's not enough money to do anything with, but it's also a security blanket that allows you to take lower paying jobs. I also think, you're not leaving. Who's leaving then? Sorry, I got that wrong. Hi, Dee and Van, you're back again. Was that Sibwolf? Who was heading out? I don't know who said they were leaving. Anyway. Okay. I think also there's the criticism that people who make way more, if you're bringing home $4,000, $5,000, $10,000/euros a month, an extra $1,200 is not going to be a big deal. But I kind of have the feeling that if you had a universal basic income, at least with employers, the actual the salaries would adjust. I think that there would be probably some market force incentives to say, well, okay, you have your base income, and then what do you need on top of that, as opposed to you getting your base income and then the universal basic income being a cherry on top. But that would require, that's a complete speculation on my part. So we'll see. Check back in Germany in 3 years, see what the effect was long term. Did it fundamentally change people's employment? And there's the whole point about automation or whatever else. And especially in the United States, there are a lot of people who work 40 hours a week and still end up qualifying for public assistance. Well, okay, one, I have an entire problem with a business model that has to be profitable at the expense of maintaining the poverty and keeping its employees in poverty. I don't think that that's a successful business model. If you can't pay your people enough that they can live on your wages working 40 hours a week, you shouldn't be a business. The problem there isn't that, we have to make those businesses more likely to spread. We have to say, no, there are some minimal thresholds that you need to be a successful business. And one of them is you need to stop relying on the federal government to subsidize your labor costs. That's not the job of the federal government. If you can't run your business without keeping people in poverty, go out of business. Come up with a new business model, because we don't need those kind of jobs. We don't need jobs that people work full time and stay in poverty. What is the point of that? And one of the things about a universal basic income is it would actually provide some sort of economic buffer for everybody, including people who are working at those exploitative jobs. Now, is that a solution? Yeah, kinda. You're kind of replacing one form of government subsidizing labor costs with another. And obviously it has to be combined with, minimum wage. There'd be I would imagine Republicans would say, well, we don't need to raise minimum wage now. We've got universal basic income. People can live on that. So, yeah, it's complicated. Right, but let's see. More Americans oppose than favor the government providing a universal basic income for all adult citizens. Americans love their means testing as well. They're like, oh, I wish we'd give this to the rich people too. Like, because it's for everybody. Like that's kind of the point. And even somebody who has a lot of wealth, they might end up losing everything and needing it anyway. And if you pay taxes into the system, shouldn't you get the same benefits? But it looks like, interesting. Let's see. People who are more economically vulnerable support it. Imagine that. So when it comes to, so here's the question. Percent who'd say they would oppose, favor, or strongly favor the federal government providing a universal basic income of about $1,000 a month for all adults. This is interesting. Adult citizens, whether or not they work. So presumably what they're saying is if you come in on a work permit, like you're a researcher, you've come over and you've worked in, you're working on a residence permit, you wouldn't qualify for this, even though you'd be paying the same taxes out of your income. I guess you gotta start somewhere, right? You can't say all residents, because then it would probably skew the results. Trans gamer girl headed out. Got it. Thank you. Oh, Sib Wolf's still here too. Hello. All right. So in total, 54% net oppose it. 45% net favor it. White people are more likely to oppose it. Surprise, surprise. They have all the wealth in the country anyway, so they are the least likely to need it. Black people as a group have a overall support, 73% support, and Hispanic people on the average tend to support it more than less at 63%. Young people who make the least amount of money. I mean, you can definitely see where this is like triangulating an issue where you stand depends on where you sit. So people who have inherited wealth or are very confident that they will be able to make money or they have enough money, like white people as a class, as a group, they are the ones who are like, no, we don't need this. People who are exploited, Black people of color, those communities where we know that there's a racial wealth gap going on, support it. Young people who get paid the least, when they start out, you don't have any experience, you don't know what you're doing, or you haven't built up that that experience that people are willing to pay for, most likely to support it. And the older you get, when you're more likely to walk into a job at a much higher tier because you're bringing years of experience and everything with you, least likely. Republicans or leaning Republicans generally oppose it. Self-identified conservatives oppose it, and even moderates and liberals collectively. Now this is going to map onto white, not perfectly, but a lot, and other demographics too. That reflects the kind of oppositions you'd see. So older people more likely to be self-identified conservative Republicans, whereas Democrats, see, everyone like craps on liberals. But when you make the scale conservative Democrat, moderate Democrat, liberal Democrat, it is the most liberal Democrats who support it. People in the upper income oppose it because they don't need it. Middle income people, more evenly divided, and of course those who would most benefit from it are the ones that support it. So, I mean, it's one of those things that I would predict you would see if you asked such a question, but because I can predict what the answers would be, that doesn't mean I know what the answers are. And now that I've looked at the survey data, I can point and say, yes, the things that we would predict independent socio-demographic factors we would predict would support for UBI do. It's pretty much what you think it would be when you ask. And did I do the one about Americans being more right-wing? Did I leave that one? Basically, the point I want to make on the left-right scale is, let me go forward. No. Let me go back to my history. Sorry. For a lot of reasons, Americans tend to. Is this the one from January of 2020? Oh gosh, that's bad. Ugh. All right, I'll just put American center right. I know that there's some 2020 data I wanted to look at. Yeah. American being a center-right country. And this is the left-wing Twitter bubble that I always triangulate what I want in American politics against what I can get. And it's a slow process. I know people want faster change, but the faster the change you want, the smaller the group is that is going to agree with you. So just in terms of, this is self-identified left-right, conservative, left-right spectrum. And it also depends, of course, as we've learned, on what people think they mean by conservative and moderate and left. But if you look at Americans' ideological view year on year, you can see that self-identified liberals, and by liberal in this context they mean on the political left, whether that's socially or in terms of government intervention, liberals or the American left has always been the minority group. We're always fighting an uphill battle. And when people get mad, I don't like John Kasich. I don't like that John Kasich was at the Democratic Convention. I will just say that. But I understand it. And this chart, I don't know if you can kind of see, it's not that great in terms of, I'll make this bigger. Yeah, that's a little bit easier to see, I think, now. I wish I had a black background, but it's just the white is so bright, it kind of throws everything off. No, I can't open it up anymore. We're fighting an uphill battle. Progressive ideas might, you can get some changes in public opinion, but a change in public opinion doesn't mean you're going to get a policy outcome. Most Americans support background checks. We are not, we haven't got background checks. And, sorry. This is why John Kasich was invited to speak at the Democratic National Convention, because at this point, Biden isn't running a party for the left. We've already had our party. We had our chance to you rah-rah our candidates. And that was the primaries. At this point, we can't win. We can't win with 24% of the total population. We have to be appealing to independents and or moderates, if you want to say. We also, in the case of Trump, we really need to peel off some Republicans or some conservative voters based on patriotism. And so what I like and what I understand and accept as a political reality gets me in a little bit of trouble. But the fact is, even if you look at the fact that we've gone up as a total percentage from 17% in 1992 to 24% in 2019, we are more than outnumbered by people who consider themselves both moderates and conservatives. So what can we do in that political space? And part of that is also constrained by this division of powers and the executive veto. It's also constrained by the role of lobbying organizations and the problematic nature of money in politics, which I can totally concede is a problem and is a corrupting influence in our governance. On the other hand, you don't hate the player, hate the game. If you want Democrats to unilaterally disarm when it comes to being able to compete on air, money in politics always ends up being media. It's they're not getting this campaign money in order to buy a boat, or if they do, they should get arrested. Money buys you access to advertising. Money is the way you get in front of voters. And if you can't get in front of voters, you can't run an entire presidential campaign on town halls because people are, too busy to show up at your town hall. You're asking the voters to come to you. And advertising and media, television, social media, all of that is you going to the voters. And to do that, you need money. And to get that money, you got to go to the people who have the money. Now, the more you get from your base, the more you get from your grassroots, yeah, that frees you up to be less beholden to special interests. But on the other hand, if you're asking people who are making $8 an hour to give you their money, in some ways, yeah. So the whole system is problematic. Citizens United was a terrible mistake, and it's going to take a constitutional amendment. But at the end of the day, if we want our liberal values to succeed, we need to be able to compete with the money machines that are pushing out conservative crap and propaganda all the time. They can't do that if we unilaterally surrender. So does that mean you might have to compromise your values in the short term to get your long-term goals? Don't get in politics if you aren't willing to get a little bit dirty. You can't stay pure in politics. Well, you can stay pure in politics, but you won't get much done. And so, yeah, we have an uphill climb when it comes to selling our ideological perspective. The other thing I want to talk about, if I can, Republicans remaining a conservative party. Yeah, that's unsurprising. I think increasingly even the more liberal Republicans are leaving the party, although you see a little bit of a drop off. I mean, 6 to 4%, 25 to 21%. I do think there is some shedding of more liberal Republicans off of the party, but I don't know how much that's going to affect overall. And in terms of Democrats self-identifying as liberal, there was sort of this peak here in, looks like about 2018, and it's a slight drop off. But even within the Democratic Party, the loudest voices, the people who are in the squad, they're only really representing, I guess like half of the party. Half of the party is not on that wavelength. So if you, again, force people in states like Wisconsin and states like Michigan and Ohio to conform with the views of people who live like in AOC's district, you're going to lose those seats. That population just isn't liberal enough to sustain somebody. You're going to get a candidate who's more toward the center, who's going to crowd out the more fringe. So, moderates outnumber conservatives among independents. So that's kind of interesting. Normally, you think that there's kind of a liberal, conservative, moderate mirroring in society, but yeah, people who see themselves as independent are more self-identifying as moderate. And ideology also differs by most demographic groups. These are going to be in line with exactly what you think they would be. Men lean decisively conservative, while women are more evenly divided. Conservatism is strongly correlated with age, rising from 26% from 18 to 29-year-olds to 46% of seniors. Liberalism, of course, moves in the opposite direction. This way. Education, those with higher levels of formal education are less likely to be conservative, more likely to be liberal. This is why PragerU finds education so threatening. Whites are more conservative than liberal, white privilege, as are Hispanics to a lesser degree, while blacks lean liberal. And the coastal regions of the U.S. are only marginally conservative in their ideological outlook, while the conservative advantage is stronger in the Midwest and the South. This is why, so what do we got here? This is the percentage. Oh, I wish this was a darker font. I'm really sorry. This is probably really super hard to read, you guys, for which I apologize. I made it a little bit bigger. But I do feel oftentimes that, here we've got the East, 32%, is 32% starting off, must be liberal. No, okay, it goes conservative, moderate, liberal. So conservative, moderate, liberal, even on the coasts, the South is more conservative, but even when we're talking about the East and the West, we're not even clearing 30% on those. So, as a consequence, the loudest voices in the room aren't always the ones that have the most support behind them. And ultimately, I want to win. I'd rather win with a conservative Democrat than a liberal Republican. And if that means having to tolerate people like Joe Manchin, I'd rather have Joe Manchin and having to take votes that I'm mad at 20% of the time than have a Mitch McConnell who's going to take votes I disagree with 100% of the time. I'm willing to sacrifice certain things in the short term to get long-term goals. And you can call me a sellout or a liberal or whatever, but I feel given the system we work in, separation of powers, the way that campaigns work, that is the most effective strategy to get what we want. So, was there something else? Oh, yeah. All right. So, just to tie into this, there was I'm going to say this and then I'm going to wrap it up because I'm really tired and I've been going for an hour and a half. That's enough, especially when I'm not feeling well. Yeah, I searched for this. This was, thunk. There was a meeting of the minds. In a way. So, Karlin Borsenko had Shoe on Head on her channel. And I listened, how far did I get? This is actually as far as I got into their show before I just had to dip out and take a mental break. So I got about 20 minutes in. It reminded me so much about Zahler's book about public opinion. There's a very famous book in political science, Zahler, I think. Oh, double L. Public opinion. Maybe I'm spelling it wrong, so I'll let the Google do the work for me. Might be Zahler. With an A, not an E. That was it. The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinion. It's a classic. Well, I guess 1992 is not that old relative to me, but it feels like it's a really old book. The basic premise is that voters don't hold a single set of preferences, or individuals don't actually possess structured belief systems that from which they can derive their public policy positions. Can I translate that from political science into normal people speak? People don't decide their ideological worldview. I go, okay, I am a progressive. Now, because I'm a progressive, when I'm confronted with an issue, I'm going to look at my progressive value system, and I am going to draw upon humanism and secularism, and then I'm going to optimize a solution to this position or problem based upon my pre-established set of beliefs and ideas that are all, and this is important, internally consistent and coherent. Most people have a lot of opinions that conflict with each other. And those opinions are subject to the narrative that is being put out by political elites. It might depend on influences like, their religious perspective. So this is, like the classic being pro-life when it comes to abortion, but then being in favor of the death penalty. Or claiming all lives matter and then not caring that immigrants are dying when they're crossing the channel. As one of my colleagues said, we emote first and then we rationalize. We have an emotional reaction to something and then we construct a reason for why we're right to hold that view. And as political scientists, if you remember, if we go back, we looked at these structures like libertarian authoritarianism and liberal conservative on a spectrum. Those all assume that when you answer these questions, you have some sort of like internal mental process that allows you to make sure that you don't have those kinds of inconsistencies. This is part of the reason why the scales don't work perfectly, is because we're trying to impose an ideological framework on people who don't think from an ideological perspective. So, by rejecting the notion that voters hold single preferences, or in fact that individuals possess structured belief systems from which they can derive policy preferences, The book challenges the usefulness of public opinion surveys. I still think they're useful, just as a thermometer thing. Zaller's argument as to how individuals form survey responses is effectively summarized by his receive, accept, sample model, which, according to the opinions individuals express, reflect the messages they have received, contingent on the degree of political awareness, accepted, contingent on the consistency with prior beliefs, and sampled from the contingent on what issues hold priority at that moment. People kind of make up their beliefs and they draw on media influences. And I think for some voters, that's probably true. We know political attitudes, like the less you pay attention to politics, the sort of less stable your views are. If you're like a politico person like me who just lives and breathes this stuff, I have so much thought. I've thought about it so much and I've been experienced it so much in terms of process that I have a deeper awareness. So I mean, Zaller isn't speaking a new truth that we accept. I think we throw his perspective in the mix and when we go, it's complicated. But when it comes to this idea that people don't have consistent political views derived from a set of beliefs that they, thought about and pondered and thought about the implications of, it hit me. Like Zaller's book on the nature and origins of mass opinion really hit me when I was listening to Carlin and Shu, because, Carlin was saying literally within this 20-minute conversation that I've finished, not even 20 minutes. Earlier, she was saying that she and her husband went on Obamacare for a period of time because she was, I think, starting a small business and he was working, I think she said, at a gas station that didn't offer insurance. And so they signed up for Obamacare and it was expensive. She was very mad that it was expensive. Then, like within 10 minutes, she was saying that when it comes to paying for healthcare, other people shouldn't have to pay for the poor health choices of other people. And she sort of pointed to herself, said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, I know I'm overweight. I know I make bad health decisions when it comes to what I eat. Other people shouldn't have to pay for the fact that I make these bad health choices. I'm like, but what you're saying is, it's okay that your insurance is expensive, but you just said you didn't like Obamacare because it was expensive. So which is it? Is it that you want affordable health care regardless of people's health concerns or backgrounds or pre-existing conditions, that affordability is the core issue that drives your perspective on the provision of health care? Or are you saying that we should allow a healthcare insurance structure that penalizes people or otherwise offsets those populations that engage in poor health choices so as to not spread the risk to people who, eat healthy and run all the time? In her head, I imagine those two positions both make sense, but they don't. When you put them, because one is a value about accessibility and universality, and the other one is about personal responsibility and accountability. And when you put them together, one's got to give. And yet she thinks she's being really clever. And similarly, and maybe it was just the wording, I'll try to be charitable to June. June's on the Biden train now. Like, what? Good. Thank you. Welcome. We all had to go for the candidate that's anti-fascist. He was very people's first choice, but he is now, I think, collectively our best choice. So welcome to the Biden train, June. You're now riding with Biden. Earlier in the conversation, she described herself as a social democrat, on par with European social democrats. The European social democrats are pretty much about, innovating in managing capitalism, redistributing incomes, really having an active role for government in making people's lives more equitable, more egalitarian as a society as a whole. But then later on, she called herself a social libertarian. Like, okay, so you're a social democrat and you're a social libertarian? Like, do you mean that, it's just like, do you mean that on social issues you're libertarian? But how can you be libertarian on your social issues when part of those social issues will involve the economy and accessibility and equity. Sometimes I think people don't, they have ideas in their heads and they use words that they think are right, but they are working within like a larger framework where it is open to misinterpretation and confusion. Because for me, social libertarianism is not like, and I can see a lot of potential contradictions with social democratic party policies and approaches to solving social problems. When she says social libertarian, is that just code for free speech? Yeah, and so anyway, I watched this and I was just reminded of Zeller, and also just how like left and right are such fuzzy concepts, and how people have a series of opinions on issues, sometimes within the same issue, and they don't always reflect on their own contradictions. So that was it. That was kind of the show that I wanted to do today. Let me look at what you guys have got to say in the chat. There's no reason to look at these two. I'll just put this off and go up a little bit. Do. All right. Lucky Wanderer says, thing is, I think most liberal democracies are center-right, by which I mean somewhat socially progressive and moderately capitalist. I do think it's important to separate out. I'm going to separate. That's a conflation of separate out. Economic positions from like social ones and political rights. So I think when we think about progressive or conservative or libertarian or authoritarian, I think there are very distinct dimensions. I don't want to, like, again, trying to be charitable to June. I can understand why someone would be more egalitarian in terms of to be more supportive of government interference or government regulation or a role for government in the distribution of wealth within a society, while also having a government that takes a role, and this is it, like, is it taking a role or walking away from? This is the difference between like interventionism and just a libertarianism, in making sure that civil society, the public spaces people occupy, are places of egalitarianism. And then there are other ways you can think about egalitarianism from a political point of view, in terms of like voting rights, also your civil rights in prison, and also like the public-private sphere when it comes to religious practices. I think there's a lot of dimensions that you can think about from a public-private dimension, and also just different categories. So the another problem too is that people tend to just, and I'm guilty of this as well, kind of conflate the social and the economic when they're really, I think, two different dimensions. They're the biggest voting bloc. Yeah. Sorry, misunderstood was being discussed about governments and populations voting for them. Okay. The unforgivable political sin is vanity. The killer died as sour grapes. Neil Kinnock, the enemy of idealism is zealotry. Yeah, I can see that. I warn you not to be ordinary. I warn you not to be young. I warn you not to fall ill. And I warn you not to grow old. That's very much libertarianism. Yeah, the kind of Ayn Rand. As long as you are young and healthy and, privileged, you can optimize your life. If you don't fall into one of those categories, you're basically the dregs that will be left behind and blamed for it by those who came to their talents or their benefits through no work or effort. The Malcolm Wood says, what's really sad, because I wanted to go on a rant about US being governed now by the radical right. Oh, yes, we're talking more about voters. But that's what you get when you talk to someone who does political behavior. I don't necessarily, my specialty is trying to, that was what drove me on my interest in my research, is trying to figure out how do people come to their decisions? What are the factors that influence it? What are the factors we can do to influence it? Like, because, you know, I have an agenda. I want to see more human rights. I want to see more equitable distribution of income. I want people to go outdoors and not have to worry that some white woman or some aggressive white man is just going to get in their face and insult them for who they are, or cis person, or religious nut. You know, I want a society free from those kinds of abuses and attacks. So, yeah, I want to understand, how do I get voters? How do voters think so we can better present our messages, so that we can get our policies across and passed. Where was I? I would argue that he's correct that people don't have a politically informed worldview, but I would argue that is because of the values they develop before they become political. Political socialization is a whole other topic. Certainly, so political socialization can be thought about in phases. There is childhood political socialization, and that is the way your initial worldviews are formatted or structured based on your location in society. If you grow up in a conservative Christian household, the chances of you maintaining that worldview and having conservative Christian values in your 80s is way higher than if you grew up in a secular house, right? So obviously where you start off from will have a big influence on what values you hold over the course of your life. On the other hand, we know that people's experience with the world does have a direct effect on, so political socialization continues. It's not just at childhood, but it continues throughout your life. So in particular, work, we know, has a big impact. Parenthood has a big impact. Getting an education, going to formal, I should say, getting a formal post-secondary education, being exposed to other ideas, and then life events. There are just things that might, you might start out as a nominally secular agnostic, and then you get diagnosed with some really life-threatening disease, and you turn to religion for comfort. I mean, the way that our lives affects us and the way that our society kind of, like, those kinds of things, it's complicated. My turn to head out. Okay, bye, Sib Wolf. You're probably long gone, but see you next time. Health expenses are dominated by costs in the first year, and the last years of life used to be when doctors pull out all of the stops to preserve life. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we know, that's true. Like, most people's healthcare costs come near the end, and that's when they're like, the most vulnerable and the most need of the services. So certainly in terms of cost, this is why you get those horrible things like the Tories were saying. Who was that asshat Kevin quoted about the value, like the economic value of the lives lost due to coronavirus wasn't worth the money, or wasn't sort of made up for by the amount of money spent. It's just, like, that's freaking like Nazi talk to me. So June worrying about the costs of the poor judgment. Oh, I should be, just to be correct, Bruce. It was Carlin who was saying, not June. June was the one who was like saying, I'm a social democrat. I'm also a social libertarian. I'm like, but what do you mean by those things? Like, to what extent? What kind of social democrat are you? Are you like a Swedish social democrat? Or are you like a German social democrat? Or are you like, what? Again, these are kind of like empty signifiers a little bit. Not empty signifiers, but they aren't always obviously clear that what she means by that. But it was Carlin who was saying that, yes, on the one hand, even Obamacare was too expensive for her to afford. But on the other hand, insurance should somehow be more expensive for people who are less healthy. I don't get it. And I gave up. I'm not going to try. I'm not going to try to construct sense around something that doesn't make sense to me, because it's not worth my time and effort. So I'm just going to note it and move on. All right, I'm developing. I think I need to change the pillow I'm using. I've woken up with headaches a couple times. I don't think it's COVID. I can still smell and taste my coffee, so that's all still good. But yeah, for some reason I'm getting really bad headaches, and I'm getting one now. Not migraines, just like neck muscle headaches. So I'm gonna go. And I'm going to switch the cameras here. What's coming up? Oh, yeah. Plugs. Today or tomorrow, I will set up for a happy hour. We're going to look at Leap Parkour, a motorcycle. Actually, it's a Vespa. Oh, he's long gone. I can't see him. Can't see what kind of motorcycle or Vespa it was. We're going to look at Leap Parkour, a Christian movie. Kevin, he had a good moan through it all. He had moments where he's just like, oh my God, I can't even anymore with this. I'm just going to die. And then other times that he was just laughing to the point where I thought we broke him. But we're going to do that probably tomorrow night or Tuesday night. I have to talk to Kevin. Other than that, I'm trying to think. One of these days I will get back to the social construction of reality. The challenge for me is at the moment I'm writing a lot for work. And when I sit down and in a 5 or 6 hour period, I write 2,000 original words and re-edit them into a coherent whole and reread the entire document to make sure. I don't have the place, I don't have the mental energy to then pick up the social construction of reality, read it once to understand it, read it a second time to make notes and structure it, and then read it out a third time to kind of like prepare it for the show or to read it on air. So I'm just going to try to find the mental energy for that sometime in the near future. And I do still have to go to Wuppertal I will have to get out of the house one of these days and maybe take a day of vacation and go to Wuppertal and ride the monorail. So you can look forward to that. If you're interested in watching any of my D&D gaming now, you'll have to go over to my channel. I think it's called D&D Gaming with Christy Winters. Very original. There's a video here on the channel where there's a link to the new channel and a Twitch channel that didn't work last night. So give me a little time on that. But I have plans to be on YouTube a lot. So you can see me if you want to stop by. Thank you for everybody who stopped by in the chat, to Sib, to DN fan, to who else was here? Lucky Wanderer, to Bruce, to Malcolm, to Eva, to Transgamer Girl. Am I forgetting anyone? And anybody who's watching in the future who wanted to just listen to me natter about, well, actually read mostly a work by Curtis and someone whose name I've already forgotten, some Caroline woman whose name I've forgotten, about left-right scales. All right, continue being geeky, you guys, and I'm going to go enjoy my flippy hair. Until next time, I have been Christy. You all have been absolutely awesome. And thank you for coming by. We'll see you again next week or even sooner. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. Bye-bye.